Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. Today I'm going to discuss this collaborations box set from Imprint. This is 8 films directed by Zhang Yimou and starring Gong Li. This is spine number 67 to 74 from Imprint, which is a lovely box set. They each get their separate cases, and there is a nice booklet. Again, obviously the box is red, because the colour red does feature in quite a lot of these films. So I'm just going to go through them one at a time. I'm not going to spend too much time on each film. What I would say, they are all pretty consistent. They're all quite wonderful to greater or lesser effects. They're all worth seeing. I'll get into the extras, because again there's a fairly common extra that runs through all the films as well. So we'll start with 1988's Red Sorghum, which is Zhang Yimou's debut, and this was pretty much Gong Li's film debut as well. And this tells the story of a young woman who's married and sent to live with the boss of a winery, even though it's really hard liquor that they make from the sorghum rather than a traditional winery from grapes. It's just the word for wine in Chinese is more, it's really hard liquor rather than wine. But her husband to be, or her husband, because she's essentially been sold, has leprosy and dies, and she's left to run this winery. And there are fairly a large amount of obstacles. It's set in the 1930s. It culminates with Japan turning up and causing all manner of problems. Zhang Yimou got into lots of trouble with the Chinese government throughout his career, and this was one of the first Chinese films that sensuality and sexuality was kind of to the forefront in bright colour. This is a beautiful film. Again, all these films should really be seen on a screen as big as possible. They are absolutely beautiful. Again, Gong Li's first film, but she gives a really wonderful performance, as she does in pretty much all of these films. And it's about the woman's role in these worlds. Obviously, all these films are, the central performance is essentially from a female perspective of the world. But Red Sorghum is a really strong debut. It's an absolutely beautiful film, and one of the best debuts you'll see. This is a 1080 print from a 2K scan. It looks wonderful, and the kind of common extra is Tony Raines, everybody's favourite Asian film expert and film expert in general. He talks about each film. He was on the set of quite a few of these films and interviewed Zhang Yimou, so he kind of knows Zhang Yimou more than most people. This also has a 1988 interview with Tony Raines, with Zhang Yimou. Granted, with Tony Raines, we all know as soon as he says, "I'll just give you a short thumbnail sketch of the background," you know you're going to be there 35 minutes later. And he does this on all of these films pretty much. But they're really informative. And he gives you like a history lesson of Chinese cinema industry. Zhang Yimou belonged to the 5th generation of directors, pretty much. So Tony Raines is indispensable as far as giving you a history of the industry, a history of where Zhang Yimou was in his life. Because as we'll see, he had a fairly interesting personal life as well as professional. But he was always getting into trouble with the censors, but then the censors in China are a little bit reactionary anyway. So his third film, not his second, because as Tony Raines keeps pointing out, his second film was a by the numbers genre film about a hijacking of a plane called Operation Cougar, which Zhang Yimou is not particularly proud of. So this is his third feature, not his second feature, Judo. And again, this is another corker. This again is a woman who is essentially forced to marry the boss of a dye factory, and he is a fairly nasty piece of work who beats her and does all manner of nasty things to her. And his nephew kind of is attracted to this woman, watches her through a peephole, and then they end up having an illicit relationship, and a child appears, even although the owner may not be able to have children, and that leads to all manner of melodramatic events. Again, this is another beautiful film. A lot is made of the different colours of the dyes. There's huge water tanks that go different colours. It's shot in this little town which is very compact and maze-like, so it has a lot of just beautiful shots in it. This is kind of out in the country, and again the sensuality of the film, and obviously Gong Li, the way Gong Li looks, got him into trouble. He would have a fairly long relationship with Gong Li, as well as quite a few of his actresses. But this is another wonderful film. This one has a 2K scan. And again, Tony Raines talks about the film at length. And there's a documentary, Shadow Play, the early cinema of Zhang Yimou, which is very good and very informative as well. So again, with these films, you're not just learning about certain periods in Chinese history, even though some of them aren't exactly accurate, as Tony Raines points out, but you're getting history lessons in the extras as well. And then we have 1991, probably the Zhang Yimou film that I've watched the most times. It's Raise the Red Lantern, which is set in 1920 in this huge mansion. Again, Gong Li comes in as the new wife, but she is the fourth wife. A fifth wife turns up near the end of the film as well, and the master, who very cleverly done by Zhang Yimou, is not really seen that much because the film's not really about him. When he chooses which wife to spend the night with, she gets a foot massage and the red lanterns are raised outside her room. And the film is really about how the four women play off each other, attack each other. The oldest one is the first wife, and then they get younger to Gong Li, then eventually the fifth wife. But it's all about the relationship and the manipulation between the four women, the people who you think are nice aren't nice, and the people you think are nasty perhaps aren't as nasty. Again, this is another absolutely stunning film visually. Obviously the colour red is fairly prominent. There's great scenes when everything's covered in snow. It's really has a wonderful atmosphere of claustrophobia, and also it is kind of a little bit creepy at times. And with a lot of these films, which I like, it does have a lovely ending. That a lot of these films wouldn't necessarily end the way Hollywood films would end. Obviously Zhang Yimou has went on to make some English language films to varied success, but certainly a few of these films Hollywood filmmakers wouldn't end them the way they end, which obviously I rather like. So this is a wonderful film as well. This one's got a 2K scan, and this has, like all of the films, as I mentioned, Tony Raines talking about it for about half an hour, which is wonderful, as he always does this. I'll just give you a brief outline of the history. Next we go to 1992, The Story of Cuisine. Now this is Gong Li. Obviously by the cover you can tell a completely different look. It is nice the fact she does kind of have completely different characters and completely different performances that really stretch her and prove how good she is. This one, as Tony Raines says, is perhaps a bit of a reaction to the kind of high profile relationship that Gong Li and Zhang Yimou had, despite the fact Yimou was still married at the time. Gong Li had become a superstar at this point, so perhaps to lower their profile, this film is almost documentary-like at times. This film uses non-professional actors. I think there's only 5 professional actors in the film. A lot of it was filmed without people knowing there was cameras there. It's much more earthy. Again, Gong Li, no makeup. She wears lots of... She's pregnant for most of the film. She wears lots of bulky clothes. This is as far away from the glamorous Gong Li of earlier Zhang Yimou films. This is arguably the greatest film ever made about a woman trying to get justice for her husband who has been kicked in the nuts by the local village chief. So they're essentially country bumpkins. The word bumpkin appears quite prominently in a later film in this collection. So she goes from the local to the authorities in the big city to try and find justice, to get an apology. She has money thrown at her, which she doesn't want. She just wants an apology. And you could argue that all the officials in the city and things like that are really reasonable, which perhaps some officials in the Chinese government perhaps aren't. So you could argue it paints everybody as being really helpful. Whether she gets what she actually wants, is you'll have to watch the film to see that. But just the layers of bureaucracy, just her determination. They have to obviously walk and get the bus, and all the while she's waddling about because she's pregnant, and she has an able assistant with her husband's sister. It's just a wonderful film, but again, completely different from the first three in this box set. It doesn't have that luminous cinematography. This is very kind of down to earth, basic. Again, some almost documentary at times, but it is charged with this central performance of determination by Gong Li's character. It's another fantastic film. This one's got a 2K scan, and again, Tony Raines goes into detail on the film for 20 odd minutes. So next we come to 1994 and To Live, which is a decade-sprawling film, essentially about one family whose husband we see at the start is pretty much a worthless gambler who's living off his dad's money, but he is eventually duped by the boss of the gambling house and eventually loses the house. But as political changes happen, that turns out to be quite a good thing, but of course his family has to suffer. Lots of people suffer in this film. There's a nice kind of symbol of shadow theatre and shadow puppetry that kind of runs through the film, which is really nice. So this goes from, it's 30 years essentially from the Cultural Revolution to renewal, or whatever it was called. So there's a scene where a stage where Mao wanted everybody's iron to be melted down into bullets to help to liberate Taiwan, which ended up, as Tony Raines again talks about, ended up being a disaster, and it ended up Mao being sidelined in the Communist Party for a while because that was such a disaster and led to starvation and all manner of problems. It does give a fairly good thumbnail overview of the history of China during this period, and Tony Raines does say it's fairly accurate. So if you know nothing about China, which I have to say I don't know that much about China, it was actually a quite enjoyable history lesson. Again, just about how far people go under certain regimes. Again, Gong Li has a wonderful performance, as everybody does. She suffers a lot. Everybody suffers a lot, pretty much. But in the end, there's some small little bit of hope, because it is just about survival. Another wonderful film. Again, this is an R2K scan, and Tony Raines again talks about To Live, and there's an interview from with Gong Li, an archival one. So that's wonderful as well. And then we go to 1995, Shanghai Tryout. This is an interesting film. This was Zhang Yimou trying to not be political and just make a genre film. strangely enough, is about gangsters in Shanghai in the 1930s, and Gong Li is essentially a gangster's mall. This is again a different side to Gong Li. For 90% of the film, she's just a horrible person who treats her new kind of lackey who comes from the countryside, so country bumpkin, very badly. There is a attempt on the boss's life, and the film kind of goes from the city out into this island in the country, where Gong Li's character softens a little bit. It's just a wonderful little genre film. Again, Zhang Yimou proving he can do this kind of film as well. His relationship kind of changed with Gong Li, because at this point she came to him during production and said she was going to marry somebody else, because he still hadn't got a divorce from his first wife. So obviously this happened during the production, but you can kind of see her character isn't perhaps as well-rounded or likeable as her characters in the films when they had a special relationship with each other. But the film is still wonderful, looks absolutely gorgeous. And again, for what it is a genre film. It is still gorgeous to look at and rather fantastic as well. She does sing in the film, and as Tony Rain says, she's not necessarily a singer, but you can read into whether Zhang Yimou wanted her to look bad, but you can make up your own mind. Again, this one is a 2K scan, and Tony Rains talks about all that juicy stuff again in another 25-30 minute piece. So they had ended the relationship. Zhang Yimou had went on to other actresses to have relationships with. So we have a gap until 2006 with The Curse of the Golden Flower, which for me is probably the weakest of the films in the box set, but it's still really enjoyable and looks ridiculous. This is based on the Tang dynasty in the 10th century, but as Tony Rain says, it has pretty much nothing historical as far as fact in the whole film. But this is just pure eye candy. Tony Rains talks about the hilarious kind of beef between Zhang Yimou and Wong Kar-wai, which I'll let Tony Rains let you know about that, because it is quite hilarious as far as pinching DPs from each other and pinching composers and pinching actors. And Tony Rains makes the point that Zhang Yimou he wasn't a martial arts kid, never grew up with martial arts, but started doing martial arts just to annoy Wong Kar-wai. And this one, I mean, the colour yellow, the golden flowers, the chrysanthemums, it's ridiculous. The palace is like an Australian's nightmare, as Spinal Tap might say. Yellows and purples, and the production design is insane. Also, there is CG, which is a little unfortunate. You'd like to see hundreds of thousands of real people. The CG is not bad, but it is CG. It's about a family. It's loosely based on a play which was kind of present day, or set not that long in the past, about a family industrial family who had lots of skeletons in their closet, and Zhang Yimou decided to adapt it and set it in the 10th century. Chow Yun-fat stars as the emperor, not the emperor of China, because the Tang dynasty, the emperor just decided to make himself an emperor and call himself an emperor. And Gong Li is his wife, who he seems to be slowly poisoning, which is affecting her mental health. And the 3 sons, and there's all manner of intrigue, which I won't go into because that would be spoilerific. But it looks absolutely gorgeous. It has really nice fight scenes, not as many as House of the Flying Daggers and Hero, which Zhang Yimou did earlier. This is more about the relationships and more about the intrigue than, I mean, there are obviously fight scenes, and the climatic battle is fairly eye-popping. But for me, it's a bit more style over substance, unlike the earlier films in this box set. But it's still really enjoyable and has, like I say, it looks absolutely gorgeous. So this one is just a 1080p. I mean, I could imagine if this ever gets a 4K, people's eyes would literally pop out their heads. Again, Tony Raines talks about it. And we have an interview with the composer, Shigeguro Omibayashi, from 2021. There's the Los Angeles premiere footage, and there's 3 featurettes, Secrets Within, The Emperor and the Empress, and behind the scenes footage, or B-roll behind the scenes footage, and trailers. So this one, perhaps not the deepest film of the box set, or the best film of the box set, but it's still well worth checking out, especially on a big screen. And then finally, from 2014, we have Coming Home, which again is a different Gong Li. This one is about a mother and daughter whose the husband and father has been in a political prison for 10 years. He escapes, tries to see them. The daughter is kind of fanatical in the party and doesn't want anything to do with him. The mother is kind of tortured with that, but eventually tries to help him. An accident happens, and then we jump forward in time where he's been released from prison after the Cultural Revolution, where intellectuals, professors, doctors were all put in at times pigsties. So he comes back, but Gong Li has a disease. I think it's pretty much Alzheimer's, but it's never mentioned as Alzheimer's. So she doesn't really recognise him. She still thinks her daughter does ballet, and her daughter gave up ballet. It's really quite moving as the husband goes through all these things to try and get Gong Li to remember who he is. But then the most important thing is he's actually spending time with her. It doesn't end the way a Hollywood film ends, which makes it all the better. Zhang Yimou does kind of keep down the melodrama, but as an audience, because you're used to these kind of stories, every time you think there's going to be resolution, or this will be the scene where she recognises him, but it's never done in a manipulative way. Again, a different performance for Gong Li. At times, obviously, she knows what's going on, and at other times, she's a little bit confused. There's great scenes where the husband is reading letters that he wrote while he was in work camps and prisons, but obviously she just knows him as the man who reads the letters for her. It's just beautifully done. You are hooked into the characters. The daughter at the start of the film, because she's kind of brainwashed into the party, and is so desperate to get the lead in the ballet. She comes across as being really horrible, but again, that's the character. And she changes, and she, as her journey goes, we find out more about what happened to her when her father went away. We find out more about what happened to Gong Li's character when the husband was taken away. It's great performances by everybody. Really wonderful film to finish the set on. Again, stays away from the kind of maudlin melodrama that perhaps it could have turned into. And it has a wonderful kind of realistic ending. So that's Coming Home, which is the last film in this wonderful box set that I would highly recommend. I think it is out of print at the moment, but who knows, I don't know whether Imprint release individual titles, or maybe in the future they might. This just is a 1080 presentation. Again, Tony Raines talks about it. There's a commentary with Zhang Yimou in Mandarin with English subtitles. There's a Toronto Film Festival Q&A, an interview with Gong Li, and there's a making of featurette as well. So that's the Gong Li Zhang Yimou box set by Imprint. I've had it for a while, but I eventually got through it all. Really high quality films, consistently good. I'm not sure any of them are masterpieces, but I think 7 out of the 8 are 4-star films, I would say, in my opinion. And again, Curse of the Golden Flower is still a good little genre film, which was stunning. It looks absolutely stunning. So really consistent box set, lovely box set, and I would highly recommend checking out the films. Obviously, you could probably go to A Touch of Film with Hus or Eric at Asian Film Enthusiast, who know more about Zhang Yimou films than I do. But again, the stuff that you learn from Tony Raines is really indispensable. And yes, he does witter on a little bit, but the information that he gives out is fairly amazing. Again, he visited the sets of lots of these films while Zhang Yimou was shooting, so he has a kind of unique perspective on the director through this period. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and hopefully you'll join me again for more In the Frame videos. This is Soldier Ronan from Soldier Ronan Films saying farewell.